8.5% swing, the Conservatives up 11%, Labour down 6%, the Liberals vote almost half, from 20% down to 11%, and a lost deposit. The Liberals are going to have some very bad news in the very great majority of their seats, though we still have yet to hear from one in which they really were very strong before.
Well, just coming back to our prediction, we are predicting, therefore, that Mrs. Thatcher will win this election with a clear majority of the kind she wanted. She said that hung parliaments and what happened last time round when there was a Lib-Lab pact was wholly abhorrent to her way of thinking that politics should be. We want a change, she was always saying, and it must be a clear change, and we want an overall majority. And our computer, which is the corporate wisdom, if you like, not only of David Butler and of Bob Mackenzie, but a whole lot of other people, is saying she is going to have that. Bob?
Well, I would only say that I think it is now very highly probable there will be a Conservative overall majority. I think 38 may be high. I would suspect it may be lower than that, especially we've heard so little from the north of England. We've had bits and pieces that suggest a much lower swing for Conservatives, and I would be inclined to say it might be a good deal closer than the computer's calculation, but I, for the moment, don't want to test myself against the machine, but that's my inner feeling.
We hear that the Conservatives have had their first gain at Nelson and Cone, I'm told.
And that only needed a swing of under 1% for them to win, only a 0.8% swing. The recount suggests that Labour was doing rather well in a marginal seat by all tonight's standards.
Well, we shall see whether it was that or whether it was somebody else, perhaps the Liberals demanding a recount in a moment, when we get that figure in.
Well, I think they lost their deposit last time. I'd be very surprised if on tonight's figures they were back in the position to demand a recount this time. Now, I'm pretty sure that we'll find it's within under 1,000 votes, quite likely under 500.
More speculation, more speculation.
Well, just past experience, wearily waiting for recounts in past elections.
We're almost at the point when we can stick with the facts, aren't we? That'll be a nice moment. We've had 23 results declared so far, 612 to come in, and over the 18 that we've had, there's a 3.9% swing to the Conservatives. That's very much at variance of the kind of results we're getting from the south. It's influenced by what's been happening in Scotland. Some of those results have been fed into that swing, and also what's been happening in the north, where the swing has been rather less. Jeremy Thorpe, with Mrs. Thorpe on his right, coming to the count in North Devon.
Where in about 2 hours or so, Mr. Jeremy Thorpe, the former leader of the Liberal Party, the man who's held the seat for the last 20 years, will know his political fate. If he wins, it will be an enormous personal morale boost at a very difficult time. He has to face charges on other matters at the Old Bailey in 5 days. If he loses in this election, it'll obviously be a crushing personal blow on top of all his other troubles. And because of all this, there's been unprecedented interest. In 10 years of reporting results here in Barnstaple, I've never seen quite so many reporters and camera crews, television cameras. In fact, the returning officers put this crush barrier to keep the rest of us away from where the count's going on. Well, in the past in North Devon, there's always been a very strong personal vote for Mr. Thorpe, but in this campaign it's been very low-key, not very many posters around. And the big question will be whether the Liberals will abstain or defect to the other parties. Mr. Thorpe's majority in the last 20 years has fluctuated wildly from as high as 11,000 to 2 occasions when it was only about 400 votes. This time the Tories are putting in a very strong challenge, Mr. Tony Speller, and the Conservatives are predicting a very close result indeed. The other complication is that apart from a challenge from Labour and from the National Front, Mr. Thorpe also has to contend with some delightful and extraordinary fringe candidates. There is, for instance, the legendary Lieutenant Commander Bill Boakes of the Democratic Monarchist Public Safety and White Resident Party. There's Dr. Frank Hansford Miller, the English National Party, who's been going around the constituency draped in a flag of St. George. There's Miss Henrietta Rouse of the Wessex Regional Party. There's Mr. Tony Whittaker of the Ecologist Party. He farms 20 self-sufficient acres on Exmoor. And then finally, of course, Mr. Auburn Waugh, who unfortunately isn't here at the count. He's the satirical writer, the Dog Lovers Party, and his campaign slogan is a better deal for your dog. Unfortunately, he's not here at the count, and as you probably know, there's a High Court injunction which has stopped him from circulating his election address. Well, the latest guess about when the result will be is it will be declared, we think, at 3 o'clock in the morning. The returning officer told me earlier that he hoped he'd be able to get back into his bed at 3:30. This is David Lomax in North Devon.
So the first Conservative gain of the night, and Mrs. Thatcher needs 35 more of these if she holds on to all the seats she had at dissolution. Otherwise 41 compared with October 74. That's assuming she loses some of the ones she gained in remarkable by-elections. This is the first Conservative gain at Nelson and Cone, and the Conservatives have also gained Rossendale.
Well, Rossendale was another one of those marginals. The swing in Nelson and Cone was, in fact, their first gain was, oddly enough, on the lowest swing of the night in any place where you can talk comparatively about swing. But Rossendale is what you would expect, I suppose, not very far from Nelson and Cone. It was about the second most marginal seat. It was only a majority of 203 last time. It would have been very surprising if Labour had held on there.
So we'll get the result from Rossendale in a moment. It's Michael Noble out there. Sidcup has been held by Mr. Edward Heath, and he's managed a swing of 6.9%. Edward Heath has played a very prominent part in this campaign, has been speaking all over the country, who was attacked by the Prime Minister, you remember. A personal attack was made on him, which the Prime Minister later rather laughed off, but he never appeared at the Conservative Central Office press conferences, and Mrs. Thatcher has always resolutely refused to say whether she would offer him a post in her government, saying that that was not the Tory way of doing things, and she didn't wish, using Mr. Callaghan's expression about her, to pull old traditions up by the roots. Later on tomorrow, perhaps, we shall discover whether Mr. Heath is to be given a post, and perhaps we'll be able to speak to Mr. Heath later on tonight. Now, Rossendale, the second Conservative gain. Michael Noble has been the MP there since October 1974, a Tribune Group member, a close colleague of Mr. Hattersley, and the swing 2.5% in Rossendale.
84% turnout, the highest of the night.
And now we go to Putney, where we're waiting for a result. We think it may be imminent. Putney, where they go
over to...
the Mayor of Wandsworth, Councillor Sidney Morris, is about to announce the results both for Putney and for Tooting.
Tooting constituency, Peter Burbridge, National Front, 682. Thomas Cox, Labour, 18,642. Richard Fife, Liberal, 2,917. Robert Lewis, Communist Party, 233. Richard Ritchie, Conservative, 13,442. And I declare Thomas Michael Cox duly elected member for Tooting.
So Labour have held Tooting again. That's not a surprise. And now we should be getting the Putney result, which the Conservatives have high hopes of winning.
Nicholas Coldroy, Liberal, 5,061. Hugh Jenkins, Labour, 20,410. David Mello, 23,000.
So that's a gain for the Conservatives.
James Webster, can we hold that for a moment, please? James Webster, National Front, 685. Therefore, I declare that David Mello...
So that's a swing to the Conservatives there of 5.6%, and overturning the previous Labour majority of just under 3,000 to a Conservative majority of just under 3,000. And that's a very good win indeed for the Conservatives. The defeated Labour candidate, Hugh Jenkins, left-winger, of course, and a former Minister for the Arts. And now it's Rodney Foster in Putney back to the studio.
Well, one suspects that is the end of Hugh Jenkins' long political career. He's been there since 1964. He's just coming up to 70, or just 70 now, and I suspect may retire. The Conservatives have gained Putney with a swing of 5.6%. They had expected to do that because they'd done very well in the local elections in Wandsworth. The National Front lose their deposit, the Liberals lose their deposit.
The swing was only 4% in Tooting. These swings are lower than the ones we are having in East London, but not quite as low as one or two other ones in central London. Nonetheless, the London area as a whole has been showing something like a 7% swing to the Conservatives, whereas the national swing at the moment is only about 5% on the 21 places where we can make reasonable comparisons throughout England. Of course, the overall swing is brought down by what's happening in Scotland.
So we have so far 3 Conservative gains, all from Labour, with 33 results in and 602 to go, and the swing now running at 3.9%, I suppose one could say, and rising. And at 1:05, this is the state of the parties. And remember, 318 is the magic figure that they have to reach. And it looks very much, on our prediction at any rate, as though Mrs. Thatcher is going to make that. But we aren't going to know whether she has, and we're not going to know a whole lot of stories about a whole lot of other people for quite a bit. In the meantime, let's just have the summary of the rest of the things that have been going on so far tonight from Angela. Angela?
Well, indeed, some of those early results returning Conservative candidates showed swings that were big enough to return a Tory government. In the marginal of Upminster, John Loveridge retained his seat, boosting his slender 1974 majority of under 700 to 9,000. The swing from Labour to Conservative was 7.8%, and the Labour share of the vote was down 1,300. At Guildford, David Rowell was returned for the Conservatives on a swing of 4.7%. His majority was almost doubled to just under 20,000. Conservative MPs were returned at Torbay on a 5.8% swing from the Liberals, and at Cheltenham, where Charles Irving retained his seat with a majority of 10,000. Well, just under 2 hours ago, Mrs. Thatcher left her home in Chelsea for her North London constituency, and at this stage she would admit only to being cautiously optimistic.
Mrs. Thatcher, can you tell us if you're feeling optimistic still?
We're just preserving government.
Are you still cautiously optimistic?
Yes,
you are cautiously optimistic. You hear the poll?
And in Salford East, a solidly safe Labour seat, there was a swing from Labour to Conservative of 2.5%. But that didn't prevent the return to Parliament of Frank Lawn, a member of the Tribune Group and the MP there since 1955. And at Salford West, the Minister for Social Security, Mr. Stanley Orme, retained his seat with a slightly reduced majority. The swing from Labour to Conservative there was 2.2%. Well, the early results from Scotland brought disappointment for the Scottish National Party. At both Hamilton and Glasgow Govan, they dropped from second to third place, and their vote fell away substantially. Both seats were held by Labour. Well, with SNP votes apparently going mainly to Labour, the SNP Vice Chairman, Mrs. Margot MacDonald, said a short while ago, there is a swing against us. Mrs. MacDonald is not standing in this election. Well, there's not much news coming from abroad to compete with our news here at home, but in the United States, the Senate has cut £100 million off President Carter's proposed foreign aid budget. Senators are urging that aid to 10 nations should be stopped altogether. These include Afghanistan, where the American envoy was recently murdered. And finally, the delay in the Caerphilly constituency, which we referred to earlier. We've heard now that the count has been postponed until 9:30 this morning. The trouble was caused by a power cut just as the counting was due to begin, and so the ballot boxes are now being kept under police protection. David.
We've heard that the turnout in Devon North, in Jeremy Thorpe's constituency, is an astonishing 89%. That's a clear 10% up on the last election, and I think without any doubt will be the highest turnout tonight. 89%. Very nearly everybody on a register that's already 2 or 3 months old going to the polls. What's the actual record turnout, David?
I believe it's 92.7 in Darwin in 1924. Going above 90% has not happened since the war, except in Northern Ireland, where rather odd things happen to voting figures.
You mean, when you say rather odd things happen to voting figures, that a lot of people who are no longer alive are still voting?
There was a very nice item on Nationwide about personation a few days ago, and the rules of the game for personation and voting the dead in Northern Ireland. But I've never heard of it being done in any significant way in this side of the Irish Channel.
One of the candidates in Ireland was over here during the election talking on Campaign Report, I think, or somewhere he appeared, and was asked how he dared leave Northern Ireland at this stage because he'd miss out on who had died and who hadn't died and who he could get to the polls and who he couldn't. He said he was watching it all in the newspapers very carefully and keeping an eye to see that the other side weren't getting those people to the polls. Now, Bob has moved across from his swingometer to, I think, what he calls his battlefield. Or is it his battleground? His battleground, Bob.
Doesn't matter what you call it. This is the most important chart of the whole exercise. Remember I said Mrs. Thatcher, on a swing to the Conservatives, has to knock out 41 seats. All these, right through to about Derby North. And to form a real majority government begins to have to knock off places like this on that swing. Now, what's happened so far? Well, she's protected her rear, as it were, by holding 2 Conservative marshals. she's bitten into the Labour seats that she must capture, but interestingly enough by a very narrow majority, 1.4% Conservative swing in Nelson and Cone. Overall, in these areas, a 3.5 swing, which has won her not only Rossendale, but Putney, the biggest gain so far, but we haven't yet seen a break into areas like this, which are necessary to form a government. So overall, certainly, a swing of 4.2 gives a small Conservative majority, but we'll be watching this board to see whether she knocks off this essential run of about 40 seats for an overall majority, or 50-something for a clear and working majority. This is the board we'll be coming back to, I hope, very often, because it does tell the story as effectively as it can be told. David, except by you, David.
Well, we have the result from Yeovil, John Peyton's seat, a Conservative hold, and a swing from Liberal to the Conservatives of 2.5%. We thought that the Liberals had dropped to third place there, but they haven't. The Liberals are second, and their share of the vote has increased
They were in
by
third
1%.
place before. They've moved up to second place. It's not been much good news to the Liberals. In this case, they have moved up.
Not according to my figures, but you'd know.
Well, I
you'd
know.
know.
I know I may have got it wrong. We're not infallible in the system.
The Home Secretary is sitting, if I'm not mistaken, in the same chair and beside the same fireplace, which doesn't appear to have a real fire in it, and in the same red rosette as the Chancellor of the Exchequer was a moment ago.
That's
and he's
right.
going to talk to Robin Day.
Hello.
Good morning, Home Secretary.
Hello.
Well, what do you think of it?
Well, it doesn't look good in the south, certainly. And I'm sad that we've lost those seats in the northwest. All I can see, and you see a much broader picture than I, popping in from my own count, is certainly a large swing in the south, that where there's a marginal seat in the north, then the swing is far less. I'm interested in what's happened in the southwest. I frankly can't see the overall position, but I'd be foolish if I didn't admit that it doesn't look good, certainly in the south.
And why do you think it doesn't look good, not only in the south, but also occasionally in the north?
Well, we'll begin the analysis when we see what eventually happens. But it's much closer in the north, and what I've found here is that there are grave fears about the industrial policy of the Conservative Party. I don't want to develop that, but that, I think, is one of the major factors, and I'd be interested to see what happens in Yorkshire that I've seen more closely in the last 3 days. There certainly does seem to be regional differences, but with London being undoubtedly a great move against the Labour Party.
Do you think the Labour Party made any significant mistakes in its campaign?
I haven't thought so. We started off from a very weak position, and we've moved steadily forward. The polls, or what I've seen of them, as I've read the papers, not in the systematic way that I do when I'm in London, being overall radically wrong. And when I left home in Leeds here this evening, when I saw the predictions that I did see then, I thought, my goodness, that's not what I've seen here in Leeds in the last week. But no, I don't think so. I think we fought the campaign well.
You haven't had your result yet, have you?
No.
And you've got to hold that?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
That's not only your seat, but Hugh Gaitskell's old seat.
Hugh Gaitskell's old seat. And we were very upset during the campaign that Mrs. Thatcher called in aid Hugh Gaitskell. It's the one thing out of it all that I felt very strongly about, and I didn't like it.
Was it a deliberate decision taken on the Labour side to fight what one might call some people call it a polite campaign, a campaign with far less ferocious attacks on the other side than one has seen in previous elections?
Well, it certainly wasn't discussed at any of the meetings I went to, but I know the Prime Minister, and that would be his way. So there was no great decision on it. It's the way that the Prime Minister would see that things should be done.
Home Secretary, thank you very much indeed. We may see you later, I hope.
I see. Okay.
Goodbye now.
Goodbye.
Yes.
Well, Sir Geoffrey Howe, in a Conservative safe seat, which he's held on to in Surrey East, has massively reduced the Liberal vote. It's down from 12,000 to 8,000, and his majority goes up by nearly 10,000. That's Sir Geoffrey Howe, who you've seen a great deal of in this campaign, who's the Shadow Chancellor, and who almost certainly will become Chancellor of the Exchequer if Mrs. Thatcher is forming a government, who certainly started talking as though he were already a potential Chancellor as the campaign went on, seemed to be fairly confident of getting that job. He's safely back in Surrey East, a swing from the Liberals of 10%.
Labour vote stable.
And we've got a Conservative gain in Hornchurch, 8.5 swing to the Conservatives. This is Alan Williams, who's been the MP there since 74 and was also there in 66, and 1970 is out. Robin Squire, on his second attempt, is in Hornchurch. The Liberal vote again drops from 7,000 to 4,500.
And there you see it, the swing, it goes to the Conservatives from both parties. If the rest of London goes like Hornchurch, or remotely like it, there are another 6 seats that Labour will lose in the Greater London area.
Well, London does seem to be very even. Its swing, the lowest swing in those seats has been about 6.5 or 7%, and the 8.5% I think is, I'll just check exactly what it is.
Well, those are all in the eastern end of London. The overall London swing is 7%. 15 seats we've had in from the Greater London area, and the average swing is 7%. And the Liberals have dropped 6% in London, down to 11%. Conservatives up nearly 10% in London, Labour down 4%. And it's worth mentioning, because we don't often talk at the bottom of the scale, the National Front have been doing exceedingly badly at the bottom of the they've been dropping only about 1%, 2%. Overall, the National Front are running at 1.1% of the vote.
We hear that Teddy Taylor, the Conservative in Cathcart, is in trouble. That may mean a recount in Cathcart, I suspect.
Well, that's exactly. There's Cathcart, and there's one of the Edinburgh seats, and there's Aberdeen South. All of these are Conservative seats that could go if there was a massive switch of SNP votes to Labour, and there obviously has been a really massive collapse. There hasn't been a single SNP seat that I remember in which they haven't dropped to 3rd place or to 4th place from the 2nd place that they had in about 50 of the 70 seats in Scotland last time.
They did say Teddy Taylor would do well because he was fighting a very personal campaign and everyone knew him. He was the only Tory holding a seat in his area, but that he actually fought it in such a, I don't know what the charismatic way is, but in such a powerful way that he actually, the Labour Party were in despair about it and said, listen, we're not up against the Tory party here, we're up against Teddy Taylor.
It would be very ironic if the Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland loses when the Conservatives are winning. It will be like Gordon Walker losing Leighton when Labour won the election in 1964.
The man who fought against devolution, what would they do with him?
Well, other seats can be found, and there is also the House of Lords.
Let's have a look at the Conservative gains so far tonight. Now this, from Labour, shows Nelson and Cone, Rossendale, Putney, which we had a moment ago, and Hornchurch. Those are the 4 Conservative gains so far from Labour, and those are from the dissolution, so that in the end there has to be 35 gains there if Mrs. Thatcher is to win. Labour hold on to Bothwell, a tiny swing to Labour from the Conservatives there. That's another of the Scottish seats.
And the SNP go down from 2nd place to 4th place, and their vote is halved.
Well, it's all very tantalising. We have a swing to the Conservatives of 4% at the moment, and according to Bob's swingometer, just over 4%. That just gives Mrs. Thatcher an overall majority.
But that swing figure is substantially affected by the fact we've got so many Scottish results in, and obviously the Labour Party is doing rather well in Scotland with SNP vote collapsing, and that does affect the overall pattern. If you look at the swing in England alone, it is 6%, the sort of thing that would produce a large margin.
Well, one of those defeated Labour candidates has come to the cameras, and he's with Rodney Foster now. This is Hugh Jenkins, who lost Putney in London, the first of the inner London seats to go.
Mr. Jenkins, you must be very disappointed. Was it a result you perhaps might have expected, though?
No, we thought that we would hold the seat, and I think we would have held it, and we resisted the national swing to some degree, but the general national swing was too much for us in the end.
Now, you fought this campaign very much on local issues because of the Conservative-controlled Wandsworth Council. That obviously didn't go down.
I don't know that that was the cause of it, because you see our vote held up very well. The Conservatives increased their vote, and they took most of those votes, I think, probably from Liberal votes. They certainly polled very well. They had a very good machine here. They pulled out their full vote, and I think that we just didn't do quite well enough. I'm glad, however, that since the seat, I'm afraid, had to be lost, I'm glad it was me that lost it. the new man that we're training to bring on now to win the seat next time will be able to start with a fresh sheet, and he'll be able to knock these people out next time.
Well, I think it's true that you weren't particularly keen to fight the seat yourself, were you?
Oh, well, it wasn't that I was not keen to fight it, but people thought, and I think they were probably right, that on this occasion it was best that it was fought by the sitting member. I think it was, and I think we'll win it back easily next time.
And what's the future for you now, Mr. Jenkins?
Well, I've got all sorts of things I'm going to do. I'm not giving up politics. I might go full circle and start writing some envelopes next time or something like that, perhaps. But I've also got a book to write, which might be an interesting story about the period of Putney in the last 15 years.
Mr. Jenkins, thank you.
Well, we have a Labour gain in Cathcart. Labour has taken Cathcart from the Conservatives, and they did also hold on to Battersea South, the next door seat to Hugh Jenkins' seat. After a recount, Theodore Wallace was just defeated there, majority of 332 to Labour, and a much, much lower swing, 4.2%. So this new Labour candidate, Alfred Dubbs, who was replacing Ernest Perry, who had been the MP there since 1964, and who's retiring, has just managed to hold on. Theodore Wallace will have to fight a third time if he's to take Battersea South. The swing so far, which we've been talking about being different throughout the country, now this shows exactly how it is. The northwest, 4%, 2% in the northeast, but down in the southeast, 6%, and Greater London, 7%.
We should stress that our figures here are rather distorted by the fact we've had nothing from the Midlands, hardly anything from the southwest, Yeovil, where the Liberals did rather remarkably well, pushing Labour into third place. But our results come mainly from the northwest, where Labour's doing quite well, only 4% swing against them, and from Greater London, where there's a 7% swing.
I hear that the Tories have gained Fulham.
Oh, that's
a remarkable seat. That was Michael Stewart's old seat, the Foreign Secretary. He wasn't standing this time, he had retired. But that is a safe, normally seen as a safe Labour seat.
It must have needed at least a 6.5% swing for it to go. It is, of course, the place that had the most celebrated of all by-elections until Orpington back in 1933 on the peace question.
It would have needed over a 6% swing, 6.5% swing, I think, for the Conservatives to take Fulham, which they've done, and quite easily too.
At 8% is the largest swing we've had in the central part of London, in the old LCC area. But the London swing as a whole is now running 7% on 20 seats in, where you can make that sort of comparison.
One wonders how much that happening in Fulham is due to a change in the nature of Fulham and the people who live there, because it's been one of those areas of London that has been changing character. Another Conservative gain in Ilford South. They took Ilford North in a by-election, now they've gained Ilford South on a swing 4.3%.
Twice what they needed to get it, but below the average in that part of London where we've been having these 8% swings all over that eastern edge of the GLC area.
So we have a number of Conservative gains in the London area. We've got overall 6 Conservative gains from Labour, but Labour has won, so we're informed, Cathcart from Teddy Taylor, the Conservative candidate, but we haven't had the figures in full yet. Newcastle East held by Labour. Some of these figures go through. We don't always talk about them. The swing there, for instance, 2.7%. The swing here, 3%. But we don't always go into the full details of those. From Conservative to Labour, that's right.
Yes,
3%.
Scotland is quite definitely going quite differently from the rest of the country, just as in a sense it did in 1945 and in 1959. There are 2 cases where we really had different behaviour in Scotland from England.
But where some of these seats are fairly safe ones and don't alter, I mean 500 or so, very rarely alter at all, we let the results go through, and you can see what's happened in your constituency and what the majority is, and you'll know whether it's up or down. There, for instance, there's a swing of 13% from Labour to the Conservative, but Dagenham, with Fords and all the rest of it, is a Labour stronghold, and John Parker had no chance of being unseated there. So we let the result go through, but we will keep careful track all the time on the implications of the swing. We'll have a look at the way in which the swing in those places affects marginal seats, which are the ones, after all, that really matter, the ones that change hands between elections, the ones Mrs. Thatcher needs to pick up.
But we should mention John Parker, because he's going to be the father of the House. He'll be the only member of the House who sat in Parliament before the war. He got elected in 1935, and he will be, by 10 years, the senior member of the next House of Commons. So although he's still in a safe seat, the swing there isn't all that important, but the return of John Parker does deserve a mention.
Conservatives hold Harrow East. Hugh Dykes, that's been a Conservative seat except from 66 to 70, when it was just a Labour seat for a brief period. Well, now, it's 1:25, very nearly. And at 1:25, we'll go our own ways and have a look at how the regions are doing. Well, at least we would have done, but perhaps we won't, because I think we've got something to show you instead. We'll do that in a moment and see how the regions are going, but we think down in Cardiff I can see headlights as the cavalcade of cars sweeps into the City Hall in Cardiff, and we think that the Prime Minister is down there.
This is the Prime Minister arriving in Cardiff South East. He's just come from his hotel. The Prime Minister arriving here at Cardiff South East. He's just come from his hotel. He was meant to have come here an hour and a half ago, but he was held up, allegedly, because there was a puncture in his police car. He has said nothing to anyone. You can see he's going in and saying nothing now. I have to report, though, that the mood here in the Labour camp is of deep dejection. His agent just said to me, it's a great tragedy for Mr. Callaghan, because he can't come back. He's due to come up the stairs here, to come through, round this corridor. This is the Mayor's parlour, where we were before, and the Prime Minister is meant to come here. He was meant to have a celebratory drink with the Mayor, with the Lord Mayor, but of course the Prime Minister doesn't drink. The Lord Mayor himself was very dejected. They're hoping that he's coming up the corridor now. This is an area which has a lot of statues of famous Welsh people, including Owen Glendower, David Lloyd George, Boadicea, who is looking down on us. Everyone's still waiting for the Prime Minister to come. They're waiting in the count for him as well. I understand that it's been a higher turnout here, although we don't have any indication of what the result will be. The result is much higher. The turnout here is 73.6%, which is compared to 70.7%. We're still hoping that the Prime Minister is coming round this corridor, which is where he's due to come, although this is a City Hall with many corridors. Most of them have been locked off, partly by the security people here, and it's conceivable that the Prime Minister may have chosen to come and make a rather undignified entrance through a back passage which would take him through the staff canteen and up the back passage, which would... We've learned that he's actually stopped just outside the Assembly Hall, where he could go into the count. He could go straight into the count, but we understand that he's still waiting there to... and he may come round this corner, which is where he's still due to be coming at any moment.
Well, Michael, we can actually see the Prime Minister coming in now.
So he's changed all his plans. Instead of coming, as he was going to, straight to his own Committee Room A, which was where he was going to watch the results in triumph. You can see there he's talking to the returning officer, the acting returning officer. The Prime Minister thought that the best way was to come straight into the count in order to avoid everyone who was waiting for him. So the special hotline that was installed in Committee Room A for him will now be unused. All the security branch people who were waiting for him, the sniffer dogs who went to check that the room was all right, all that has gone for a Burton, as the Prime Minister now, clearly, although he won't say anything to anyone, seems to accept that he will not be the person who's forming the next government. You can see who's with him. His wife, Audrey Callaghan, is with him, and next to him is his agent. You can just see him in the spectacles, Jack Brooks, on the left-hand side of the picture. His agent was dejected when I talked to him a few minutes ago. His agent told me it's a great tragedy. Here was a man who was going to be one of Britain's great Prime Ministers, but he was never given the chance. And the feeling here, ironically, is that the man who has lost this election for the Prime Minister, and this is, I'm talking from Cardiff South East, is another Welshman who only a few months ago, with the Prime Minister, opened the Labour Party headquarters here in Cardiff, which is the Transport House here in Cardiff. He's Moss Evans, and the feeling here is that Moss Evans, whose own road hauliers caused the strike during the winter, was one of the people who has caused this tremendous swing against Labour. And one Welshman I talked to tonight said the public education of Moss Evans has been the most expensive lesson in Labour Party history. You can see the Prime Minister there. He's walking around the count. He's still talking to his agent. We just saw the Lord Mayor, who we talked to before. The Lord Mayor, of course, is the actual returning officer. We're expecting the Prime Minister's actual declaration by about 3 o'clock this afternoon. He has a number of odd candidates.
Well, I'm making signs at the machine. We'll go back there, of course, when the Prime Minister's result comes through. It's curious if there really is a statue of Boadicea there. She's one of the handful of women who've ruled Britain, and maybe she'll be joined by Mrs. Margaret Thatcher tomorrow, if things go as they are at the moment. We've had extraordinarily strong swings against Labour in the area around Ford's at Dagenham, you remember, whose workers defied the government's incomes policy. 14% in Barking, 13.4% swing against them in Dagenham itself. Really enormous swing. Do you think that would be...
Well, you can't see any other explanation. They're 4% above any other swing we've had tonight. These two things quite out of line with the rest of things. The East London was high swings. It might explain the high swings we had in the whole Hold Church area.
Certainly Oppenheim in Gloucester has a very low swing to her, 2.6%. The spokesman on consumer affairs for the Conservatives, and said to be much admired by Mrs. Thatcher. Well, now at this stage, let's really do what we said we'd do and have a look at how things are going in the regions at just after 1:30, when this is the state of the parties after 64 results.
Well, so far tonight, London seats have dominated the South East news, mainly because the capital's returning officers haven't had to deal with the local elections as well. And the current state of the parties is that the Conservatives have won 19 seats with 4 gains, and Labour has held 10 seats with 4 losses. The share of the vote tells the story of Conservative triumph. The Conservatives have 49% of the vote. Labour has dropped 37%, and the Liberals aren't doing all that well either, with 12% of the vote. Now, if we look at the change in the share of the vote, we see a big swing to the Conservatives, bigger than the national average, with Labour doing badly and the Liberals down a disappointing 6%. Now, the first Labour MP to lose his seat in London was the former Arts Minister Hugh Jenkins, who lost Putney on a 5.5% swing. And another well-known figure in trouble, Industry Minister Alan Lee Williams, was defeated in his Hornchurch constituency, while Alf Dubs was faced with a recount in Battersea South to see whether Labour could hold on, and in fact he scraped home by just 300 votes. Well, in the South East, there have been far fewer results so far in all safe Tory seats, but here too, the Conservatives have been doing well. On the percentage change, the picture is the same, with Tories gaining from Labour and Liberal. But I'm sure that Bob Mackenzie has some predictions to make for other South East seats, which will be coming up shortly. Bob?
Well, although so far the London seats have been making the running, there are plenty of other key seats in the South East that will be declaring a little later on this evening, which Mrs. Thatcher will be banking on winning in order to get a comfortable overall majority. And on current showing in London and the South East, she looks like winning them. North of London in Hertfordshire, Hemel Hempstead's Labour member here, journalist Robin Corbett, holds his seat with the smallest socialist majority in the South East, just 485 votes. While his next-door neighbour in Welland and Hatfield, Mrs. Helene Hayman, Labour's youngest lady MP, isn't much better off. She's got a majority of just 520 and must be hoping against hope that her powerful support for the controversial 146 airliner project, which employs thousands of workers in her constituency, will stave off defeat. And even at Watford, held by Labour for the last 15 years, their new candidate, Tony Banks, who may remember once criticised the Archers for political bias, has a real fight on his hands. And down in Kent, in the Medway towns, there are 2 highly marginal Labour seats, which are also very much at risk. Down here. There's Gravesend, where the electorate has voted with the government in every general election since 1955, and may well be doing so again. John Ovenden, banking on his constituency record and support of the big immigrant community, but a swing of just 1.7% will put him out and make former newsreader Tim Brinton, you may remember, Gravesend's new Conservative MP. Next door in Rochester and Chatham, Bob Bean will lose his seat on a swing of just over 2%, and Mrs. Peggy Fenner, and former junior minister in the last Heath government, will regain the seat she held from 70 to 74. Bob Bean may hope that the Chatham electorate will be grateful to the Labour government for keeping the naval dockyards going. We'll know soon whether that hope was vain or not. Back to Angela.
Well, the delays in counting votes this year have meant that we've had far fewer results so far in the southeast. But one other declaration we should be able to bring you shortly is the Donish battle for the university city of Oxford. Because there, Labour's candidate, university teacher Evan Luard, is defending a majority of just 1,036 against a Conservative university teacher, John Patton, while the Liberal, Dermot Rofe, must have a chance as well. After all, he's a university teacher too. Well, that's it from us from the southeast. For the national picture, let's go back to David.
I've been caught with the traditional sandwich. Like father, like son. We hear that Liverpool Edge Hill has been held by the Liberals. That was the seat that David Alton took in a by-election. He was only an MP for 9 days, and he's held that seat. His majority has been halved, but he's held it, 4,000 votes. Here are the full figures of his result there. 12,700, majority of 4,200. So right. The Liverpool Edge Hill is held by the Liberals, and they were hoping they might pick up one or two other seats like that in the Liverpool area, in the inner cities. Now, we have to be cautious about this percentage share, because this is from the 1974 election, not from the by-election. And it shows the position now, 52% for the Liberals, 35% for the Labour, Conservatives 13%. We'll have a look in a moment at the regional swing, I think, because that is very interesting and has been different all across the country. Let's see if we can get those figures. Well, welcome back to those of you who've been away in your own part of the country looking at your own results. Those of you who are in Scotland will probably have heard by now that Bruce Millen, the Secretary of State, is back in his constituency, but the swing was only 0.5% there. A swing against him, I think, against the Conservatives, of 0.5%. The Conservatives have held on to Ilford North, which they took in a by-election, and which Labour hoped to get, and the Liberals hold on to Liverpool Edge Hill, as I said just a moment ago. Some of you weren't with us at the time. That's David Alton, the young MP, who came into the House of Commons, who might only have been there for 9 days, though he'd have got his pension for 3 months, and they've held on to that, though his majority was greatly reduced.
That's the first Liberal seat we've heard from tonight. It will gratify them enormously. We haven't, of course, heard from seats in which the Liberals were strong. The Liberals are doing actually rather well in the southwest, comparatively.
Well, there's news of a recount at Salisbury, which is one of the seats that the Liberals were hoping to get.
It's a very surprising thing for them to be doing as well as that, though it is justification, if it's true the Liberals are challengers, for David Steele's remarks.
The story tonight seems to be not just that the prediction is that Mrs. Thatcher will form a government, but much more that the swing has been so varied over the country. This is how it's looking at the moment. Far from the old pattern where you used to get a fairly regular swing. You see the swing from Labour to the Conservatives, that's the number in any 100 of voters who decide, having voted Labour last time, to vote Conservative this time. It's 3 in 100, 2 in 100 in the northeast. But when you get down to the southeast, 6 in 100, Greater London, 7 in 100. And in Scotland, the opposite is happening, and the swing is the other way. The effective swing is about 1% from the Conservatives to Labour. So that may be largely to do with what's been happening to the SNP, the collapse of the Scottish nationalist vote.
And we should stress that the picture is very much influenced, that in England we've had 64 results, but 40 of them are from the Greater London area, where they're only counting for parliamentary and they haven't had to sort out local government ballots. And this does distort the picture we're giving you.
Well, we've had this great gap of Midland seats. In fact, we haven't had... Have we had any Midland seats?
We've got one. We've had one from the West Midlands, but I think that's... I'm not certain what seat that was. It may have been Gloucester. I'm not sure whether that's defined as West Midlands or South West. But it was at 4.5%. North East had a very low swing indeed, under 2%.
Well, now, Cledwyn Hughes, who went out to Rhodesia for Mr. Callaghan, used to hold the seat in Anglesey and is retiring at this election, but the result from this island of Anglesey has just been given, so let's go over there and I think see the returning officer giving the count.
I, William Williams, being the acting returning officer for the Anglesey constituency, hereby give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows. Keith Lander Best,
Conservative,
15,100. John Gwynner Jones,
Liberal.
3,500. David Elliston Morgan,
Labour.
12,283. John Lazarus Williams,
Plaid Cymru.
7,863. And that Keith Lander Best has been duly elected to serve as member for the said constituency. Thank you.
So the Conservatives have taken Anglesey, and Luston Morgan, the man who led the Labour Party's campaign on devolution in Wales for the devolution bill, has been defeated. Cledwyn Hughes used to hold that seat, had it ever since 1951. And a new candidate goes in and is defeated.
And that's the first time the Conservatives have ever had Anglesey.
A recount at Paddington. So we've got a couple of recounts going now. Paddington, which is Arthur Latham's seat, will be a 3.2% swing needed to unseat Arthur Latham, who won it from Nick Scott, the Conservative, who then became the MP for Chelsea. Now, we have another form of prediction at this time, which is the seats that we think it's likely that Labour will lose. And here we are, a 90% chance that the Conservatives will gain these seats tonight or tomorrow, and 90% chance being, if you like to put it another way, very likely indeed that the Conservatives will gain those seats.
But two of those,
and there are more than those to come.
And those are mostly from SNP and Liberal, those predictions. I'm myself rather sceptical about the Liberal ones.
Cornwall North, for instance. Now, these are the ones that we think, at the end of the count, are going to go on the present form to the Conservatives. You can see the little white dots showing the areas where the Conservatives, we think, will pick up seats.
Dumbarton East must be a mistake, I think, in the light of the figures we've had from Scotland.
Well, it ends with Ealing North. And we have other predictions of things that it's more likely than not they'll pick up. But I think that list will be rather too long at this stage of the evening. So we'll leave it with those ones, which will be enough anyway to get them safely through. So we have a recount in Paddington, which suggests not as big a swing against Labour in Paddington as in the southern parts of London that we've been having.
Only 3.2% swing needed there.
The Anglesey full result, this is a Conservative gain in the Isle of Anglesey. You can see the little white dot flashing off the northwest coast of Wales. Luston Morgan, who used to be the MP in Cardigan, came here as a new candidate and was defeated on a swing from Labour to the Conservatives of 12.5%. This is the first result we've had in from Wales, and incidentally, Plaid Cymru's share of the vote rose very slightly, as you see, 1% there.
It's a quite extraordinary result, this, and I think must be a tribute to a personal vote for Cledwyn Hughes. Elliston Morgan may have suffered from coming from further south in Wales, and they mind a great deal what part of Wales you come from. Nonetheless, that sort of movement from Labour to Conservative in Anglesey is very startling indeed, and the collapse of the Liberal vote, the Plaid Cymru had some hopes there. If they haven't made a breakthrough, it's one of the two Welsh-speaking seats they didn't hold, predominantly Welsh-speaking seats they didn't hold in the last Parliament, and they haven't made any progress there.
Well, I think at this stage we've had 90 results in, 545 more to come. We might hear from the sages at the other desk who've been saying what a fruitless business prediction is. Robin?
Well, we have an average national swing of 4.2% so far, with the variations which have been explained. Peter Jenkins, how do you analyse it now?
Well, I think the most interesting facet of it all so far is the small swing in Lancashire. And the most unknown factor is what's going to happen in the Midlands. And we really have no evidence about the Midlands yet. Now, there was a lot of debate last week as whether the Midlands were going to belong to the South, whether the Midlands began at St Albans, or rather whether the North began at St Albans, or where the North began. And this, I think, is going to be crucial in determining the size of Mrs Thatcher's majority as the evening now goes on.
Do you see what has been called the Thatcher factor operating in the North?
Well, I think this must have something to do with it. You see, after all, the liberal people who vote Liberal in the North probably historically are Labour people, or they're more likely to be. They have a working class tradition to return to. But I think also that, as we heard Merlin Rees saying from Leeds just now, but I think that in the north, this muttering about Mrs. Thatcher was stronger. That was my experience as I went around the country.
Peregrine Westthorne, do you have any new thoughts?
I think it's extremely interesting watching the variations of popular reaction to the election. What this indicates to the problems of government. We talk about if Mrs. Thatcher wins tomorrow, we'll all be talking about a swing. We've got a Tory Britain, or if Mr. Callaghan wins, a Labour Britain. Of course, this is never the case. You get these incredible divisions. That's what makes the art of government such a fascinating one, that you've got to, in fact, blend the various differences together. And I think that, you know, watching an election, one is made aware of this, that you talk about a country having a particular political viewpoint from time to time. Of course, it isn't so. I mean, various areas have different viewpoints. And this makes it very difficult to govern.
Does this conform with your impressions as you've been travelling around the country, which you've been doing quite a lot in this election?
Well, I travelled in one area, which is, again, if you're a journalist, you travel in one area and you write about your impressions based on that one area, how wrong you can be. Other areas are going different ways.
What do you think about the Thatcher factor as far as the north is concerned?
Well, I said before, I think that the basic truth about the present situation is that a majority of people in this country are going right in their policies.
Can I just tell you that Jim Sillars of the Scottish Labour Party has lost South Ayrshire, and invite your comment on that, Peter?
Well, I think that was very much to be expected. He made a very bad bet and thought that nationalism was going to take off in Scotland. It turned out not to. He broke away from the Labour Party, but what we've seen, in fact, is that the Labour Party now has become the party of devolution in Scotland, while the SNP looks as if it's going to be virtually wiped out of Parliament.
Would you say that the people of Scotland appear to have voted in a pro-devolution way?
Well, devolution was not
SNP, but something of the Labour kind.
Yes, I mean, from what we know, unemployment and prices were their main concerns, but nevertheless, the Labour Party in Scotland is clearly committed to a policy of devolution.
Now, there's a Midland result you were looking for.
Right, well, let's see what the swing was.
Well, we haven't yet got it, and we may have it in a moment. Perry, you were about to say something else?
On the SNP thing, again, it's absolutely incredible a year ago that political parties thought that the nationalist vote was the crucial element. The whole, I suppose one of Mr. Callaghan's great mistakes was devolution, a fundamental political miscalculation.
Yet it doesn't seem to have done the Conservatives much good by their coming away from their original Heath position on a Scottish Assembly.
No, but I mean, you see, a year ago it was really thought that such was the strength of the nationalist movement that the United Kingdom might break up. Yeah. We now realise that this was just a temporary aberration.
But Perry, this separate general election which has taken place in Scotland, and that's what it is going to provide a mandate for Labour's policy, which is to set up an assembly in Scotland. It's going to repudiate Mrs. Thatcher's policy, which is not to set up an assembly. Now that's how Scots are going to interpret it, isn't it?
I wouldn't have thought so. I would have thought that it would suggest that Scotland is still basically Labour for socialist reasons, and that the devolution issue wasn't the crucial one.
Yes, but you can't pick and choose out of a party's programme. And when a party, by our tradition in this country, when a party is returned to power, it's returned on the basis of its whole programme.
Thank you very much indeed. For the moment, David Dimbleby.
Well, we have news there that George Reid lost Stirling East for the Scottish Nationalists, and that Jim Sillars was defeated. He came second in the polls, you saw, did well in Ayrshire South. Jim Sillars, who set up his own party, the Scottish Party, in favour of devolution in Scotland, and he was defeated there. We've heard from Finchley that the count in Finchley it's Mrs. Thatcher's seat, is being delayed because there are 291 votes missing. And it may interest you that the Tory victory in Anglesey is the first since at least 1700. We haven't been able to go back much further than that, and I'm not sure that elections before 1700 even David Butler was able to calculate swing on. The Tory there is also fighting a seat in Brighton on the council, and certainly didn't expect, he says, to win, or expect, so we're told, to win. So the Scottish state of the parties at the moment, let's just have a look at that. There are 25 results in, Labour 22, the Conservatives 3, and
the SNP in Scotland has gone down by more than half. You can see the share of the vote here is quite different from last time. Look at the change in the share of the vote. Labour and the Conservatives up almost equally. The SNP down 16% on the seats we've had in so far, from about 28% to about 12%. They've lost Stirlingshire East, which was their third safest seat, and it looks as though perhaps Donald Stewart will come back once again as the only Scottish nationalist in the next Parliament.
Now, leaving Scotland aside for a moment, how important are these Midland seats going to be that we haven't had? We've only had 2 seats in from the Midlands. In fact, the disparity of seats is extraordinary. In England as a whole, leaving aside Scotland, of course, and Northern Ireland, which we don't get, we've had 61 results, 40 of which have been from the Greater London area. We've had nothing much from the southeast, we've had nothing much from the southwest, and we've had only 2 seats from the Midlands. Erith and Crayford, held by James Wellbeloved. That's a safe-ish Labour seat, a swing of 6.7%. That's on the south of the Thames in Kent. How important is the Midland swing going to be?
The Midland's going to be very important, but we still have had 2 in, and they show a 5% swing, much below the Greater London thing and the southeast.
Those were the 2 Salford. No, they weren't Salford. Sorry, they were the Wolverhampton ones. That's right, yes.
They used to be among the very first ones to come in. But no, they indicate that the swing is probably going to be within the national average. It's not going to disturb our prediction very much. I still think I'm going to be very interested in what happens in the fringe seats in the southwest. The Liberal vote does seem to be holding up much better than in other areas. They may hold on to those seats. I think that we may have counted Liberal defeats a little prematurely in that list of seats we put on the air a few minutes ago that were 90% certain to change hands.
The Paddington recount, which we were talking about, is at Arthur Latham's request, which suggests it's he that's in trouble at Paddington.
Well, he'd be doing very well to hold on in terms of the swing that we've been having throughout London so far this evening.
Ashton under Lyme.
That's Robert Sheldon, from the Treasury, who's back there in Ashton under Lyme.
Ashton under Lyme, I think, had one of the most famous by-elections when it was all so close. And there was a huge turnout, and the mayor of Ashton under Lyme, I think, sent up rockets to say who had won. There was an election in 1928, 89% turnout, and it was so hotly contested, and he sent up a yellow rocket, which meant it was a Labour victory.
But also in Ashton under Lyme, in 1892, I believe, about then, there was a tie, a 3-way tie, and the mayor's casting vote decided the election.
Well, this time it was very safe. Labour majority of 8,000 or 9,000, and no yellow rockets. 104 seats have come in now, and swing to the Conservatives showing 4.2%. Perhaps we should have a look at a moment at just how things are going, and at our prediction, which has changed a little, I think, since we last had it. Austin Mitchell has held on at Grimsby, the seat that he took in the by-election. And there's been a Labour gain in Stirling East and Clackmannan. So George Reid, the SNP candidate, is out at Stirling East and Clackmannan. It would be nice if we could see the Grimsby result again in a moment, which was the seat that was the Foreign Secretary's before his death.
And produced one of the most surprising by-election results of the Parliament when Labour didn't lose it, when everyone knew that, of course, they were going to lose it. And then they suddenly lost Ashfield, and everyone knew they were going to keep.
He almost went up to what, Austin Mitchell, that is, to what Anthony Crosland had at the last election, 6,000. So now we might just go and find out what's been going on this time at Teddy Taylor's count at Glasgow Cathcart. The Conservatives holding on there.
Yes. 17,550 votes. 17,550 votes. Teddy Taylor, Scottish Conservative, 15,950 votes.
And that's the shock result in Glasgow Cathcart.
Henry Will, Liberal Party, 2,042 votes. And I declare John Alston Maxton has been duly elected to serve in Parliament as member for the constituency.
So there we have Scotland's charismatic Tory, the Shadow Secretary of State in the last government, Teddy Taylor, deposed by the Labour Party, in which they have always considered to be logically one of their seats, a residential area in the south of Glasgow, but with one of the biggest housing schemes in the country. A housing scheme called Castlemilk, where Teddy did remarkably well over the last few years, but now taken by the Labour Party. And here is the victor.
You're taking up my time, actually. Mr. Returning Officer, ladies and gentlemen, and that's for the Tories, comrades. Can I first of all thank you, Mr. Returning Officer, for the very able way in which you and your staff...
So,
Maxton, a nephew of Jimmy Maxton, the famous Red Clydesider of the 1930s, goes to Parliament in this quite remarkable victory over Teddy Taylor. This could cause considerable problems for Mrs. Thatcher, if indeed she does form the next government, when she comes to form her Scottish team, because, of course, Teddy Taylor was the shadow Secretary of State, would have been the Secretary of State if Mrs. Thatcher gets in and Mr. Taylor had been returned. Hasn't happened. Bill Miller, what do you take from that? Is this an aberrant result, even given the fact that Labour is doing so well here in Scotland?
Yes, indeed. It required a 2.3% swing to take Glasgow Cathcart, and the swing to the Labour Party from the Conservatives is only just over 1%. So Teddy Taylor did worse than the average of Scottish swings. It does raise the question, don't think we've had the Edinburgh Pentlands result in yet, but it raises the question of whether Rifkind might go in Edinburgh Pentlands, and that will be another Labour gain.
It does seem, since we've had these other results, including the SNP losing East Stirling and Clackmannan, that the Labour swing is absolutely massive against both the Conservatives and the Scottish Nationalists.
No, the Labour Party is getting only a small swing against the Conservative Party, but Labour and the Conservatives are getting massive swings against the SNP.
Yes, but there are a couple of... Yes, that's right. So that the SNP vote crumbling makes certain Conservative seats vulnerable.
The SNP vote crumbling means that both the other parties ought to be gaining. It does not, in fact, explain the Cathcart result. In Cathcart, for example, the SNP only had 16% of the vote last time. So I don't really think that the decline in the SNP vote, which must have been much less in Cathcart than elsewhere, can be the real explanation as to why that seat went to Labour.
Well, that's the Labour gain from Glasgow Cathcart, from the Conservatives, and here are the full figures. Teddy Taylor, the second one there, who would have been Secretary of State for Scotland, almost without doubt, in a Thatcher government, is defeated. And I think I was falling behind myself, because I think I'd already said as we went over that it looked as though Teddy Taylor had been beaten. Anyway, he was. We're waiting for the count from Dunbarton East, which we're going to get in a moment, where Margaret Bain is hanging on to 22 majority for the SNP.
So I wanted to say, firstly, so far we really have had a much greater disparity, diversity of results than in any previous election. One's been sitting here commenting on these results. So really it's not just the Scottish and English thing, but even within England there's a much greater scatter of swing. There is much more individual voting, which may mean more individual judgment by ordinary voters.
This is the Labour gain. This is the Labour gain in Stirlingshire and East Clackmannan, an SNP candidate, George Reid, who was the spokesman for them on devolution and the EEC and a whole range of other things, as people in small parties tend to be, was defeated, and SNP to Labour swing of 8%. There's a recount in Keighley.
Well, that's rather good news for Labour almost in tonight's results, because Keighley was a seat that should certainly have gone on the national swing we've had. Actually, also George Reid only just lost that seat, and his vote only dropped 10%, which is rather good as Scottish nationalist votes have been going this evening.
Keighley only needed a 3.6% swing to fall to the Conservatives, so if Keighley's having a recount, that's another... We've had one or two of those.
Well, I want to underscore the fact that the swing in marginals is very decidedly lower than the swing in other seats. It's been running at about 4% or just under 4%, barely at the level that would give Mrs. Thatcher a clear majority. I still think that she's going to get a clear majority, but one does, when the swings are so varied, have just a certain reservation. None of the sort of confident simplicities of previous elections can apply to the results we're having at this moment.
6% swing against them in Mitcham and Morden, but they hold on to it all the same.
Here's our second Welsh result. You saw in Wrexham. And there the Plaid Cymru, they've taken away the figures, but didn't do particularly well.
Swing from Liberals to Conservative, 9% in Orpington, that famous old Liberal seat. The Liberals are still second in Orpington, though, Labour way down at the bottom of the poll. Let's just have a look at the way the national vote is going at the moment. After 118 results, that number of votes registered.
Labour has got more votes than the Conservatives.
And this is the share at the moment, but of course this share is, at this stage, not telling you very much, because only when almost all the seats are in will that share really mean anything. The figure that does mean something is the next one, which shows the way that it's changed after 118 results.
And that change means that undoubtedly, when all the figures are in, the Conservatives will have appreciably more votes, 3 or 4% more votes than the Labour Party. On a 4 or 5% swing, it'll be 5-6%. The Liberal vote has collapsed, except possibly in some seats where they are relatively strong, and they have held on to their by-election gain in Edge Hill, the one really strong Liberal seat we've yet heard from.
What do you anticipate the Liberal popular vote ending up at, David?
Well, I think it'll be between 3 and 4 million.
SNP hold Angus South, an SNP hold on a swing of 10% from
that-
Labour to the SNP.
That's tactical voting.
That's an interesting result.
It's an extremely interesting result. Those figures are astonishing figures.
Labour, which was third, goes second. The Liberals, which were fourth, go third. And the Conservatives, who were second, drop to the bottom there in Angus South.
That is a very important result, because everything we've had from Scotland so far has been from the main central industrial belt where the SNP has collapsed. But if those figures are absolutely right, and they really are astonishing, then the SNP's prospects are much better than we have in fact been suggesting.
I think they're very
said
suspicious, though, because there's a 30% drop in the Conservative vote, from 15,000 to 2,000. It doesn't sound very likely.
No, I think we'd better have a double check on those from Scotland.
A double check or a treble check. In the meantime, while we're checking that, Bob.
David, overall, the national swing, on average, throughout the whole country, is just over 4%, or enough to give Mrs. Thatcher a small overall majority. But this time, more than in any other recent election I can recall, the swing varies enormously from one part of the country to another. 6, 7, 8% in various parts in the south. Often in seats, by the way, where the Tories are there anyway, and the great swing to them isn't any great advantage. We've got very little yet from the Midlands, and in the important marginal constituencies, the very important ones, where she must clean the board in order to keep the prospect of an overall majority, it's holding awfully close to 4%. So, and Labour, of course, is improving its position in Scotland, partly as a result of the virtual collapse of the SNP, and Labour is able to take a shadow spokesman, Teddy Taylor's seat in Cathcart, for example. So it is not the right moment, in my view, to say Mrs. Thatcher has a big majority. She has the almost certainty of a small majority, but there's a lot to be fought for in the results still to come. And I think myself it'll be somewhere in that region, and not anything like the first thoughts we had when some of the swings were around 7%, suggesting a huge Conservative majority. Back now to David.
Well, we made a slight mistake here on Angus South, but before I say that, let's just have a look at that. We made what you might call a slight cock-up. The Conservatives weren't 2,000, they were 20,000, and they won the seat. So you can thank the computer for that. The Conservatives gained Angus South. The SNP just second on the poll. That's Andrew Welsh, who's been the MP there since October 74.
Much the best SNP result yet tonight, because they only dropped 1% of the vote, and there's some tactical voting. Perhaps the Labour Party went down, Labour and Liberals both lost their deposit. It was a narrow result last time for the SNP, narrow against them this time.
We have unofficial reports that the Foreign Secretary David Owen may have lost his seat at Plymouth Devonport. Unofficial, unconfirmed, but that's what's being told us. At the moment, Labour has 73 seats. They have to get 318. The Conservatives have 55. They have to get 318. And the Liberals have 1. We go over to Dumbarton East now for the result.
1,600. And I declare that the undermentioned person has been duly elected to serve in Parliament as a member of the Norman Hall.
So a great night here for the Labour Party in Cumbernauld, with Labour Party home by nearly 3,000 votes. Conservative in second place, and again the SNP votes slumping very badly, down to 12,654, with the Labour Party getting over 23,000. And the Labour supporters in rampant mood there, as Norman Hogg moving forward to speak.
Well, as I was saying, it's not much good being told that the undermentioned has won, if you've not heard who the undermentioned was. Anyway, that was the Labour candidate taking Dunbartonshire East, and that's Norman Hogg, and Margaret Bain, who's been a lively SNP Member of Parliament since October 74, spokesman on education and social services, one of the most attractive SNP candidates, and she's gone third in the poll.
And it justifies
the
the poll.
the Conservatives go second. It proves our poll was right, doesn't it?
Well, we exaggerated the scale of the Labour victory, but we got the order of the candidates right and the drop in the SNP vote almost exactly right.
They're having, as you see, a second recount in Paddington, Arthur Latham's seat. So we'll wait for news of that.
But three gains for Labour now. Scotland is, and one offsets the 6 losses they've had in England to some degree, and we're still waiting with this uncertain election. The pattern is almost certainly going to produce a very comfortable majority for Mrs. Thatcher, but we still feel that there are things to watch for which may produce unexpected results.
We still only have 5 results in from the Midlands and only 3 results in from the southwest and only 4 results in from the southeast, all due to this double voting this time, which has been holding up many of these results. And at just after 2 o'clock, let's just have a look at the state of the parties. You see the SNP have lost 3 seats and picked up none. The other figures, -4 and +7, you must be cautious about. It doesn't mean they've simply lost 4 or gained 7. It's a net change. In fact, Labour has had 3 gains and 7 losses, making a net drop of 4, and the Conservatives have had 8 gains, but they've had 1 loss, and it makes a net change of 7. And on the basis of that, we are predicting at just after 2 o'clock this result in the 1979 general election: the Conservatives with a majority over Labour of 74, and with well over the 318 they need to form the next government. Well, I think at that stage, with that being the story, us waiting still for these Midland seats to come in, and waiting in particular now perhaps for David Owen to come in from Plymouth, and me picking up the message here to say that the Conservatives have held Richmond, which means that the Liberal candidate Alan Watson, who was hoping to take Richmond, has failed to do that. Let's just look over the stories we've had during this election night so far with Angela.
Well, as you probably heard, Mr. Merlin Rees has admitted that things don't look good for Labour in the south. Among the Conservative gains, Putney, where Hugh Jenkins, a former Minister for the Arts, was pushed out by David Mellor, who has a majority of 2,600. The turnout in Putney was 76%. Other Conservative gains have included Hornchurch and Nelson and Colne in Lancashire, where Doug Hoyle, a newly appointed member of Labour's National Executive, was ousted from his seat by the Conservative David Trippier. A swing of 10% from the Liberals at Surrey East helped return Sir Geoffrey Howe, tipped as Chancellor of the Conservatives if they do form the next government. Well, the Conservative spokesman on consumer affairs and prices, Mrs. Sally Oppenheim, is also back in. MP for Gloucester since 1970, the swing to Conservatives there was comparatively low, 2.6%. Well, against this background of successful Conservative results, another prominent Labour Party member added his comment. Ron Hayward, the party's General Secretary, said the tide was going the way of the Conservatives, but it was too early to concede defeat. From Mr. Callaghan, as he arrived for the count at his Cardiff constituency, no comment on the way things are going. He's defending a majority of 10,000, and within the next 2 hours he'll know whether he too has lost votes to the Conservatives. Well, at Sidcup, Mrs. Thatcher's predecessor as party leader, Mr. Edward Heath, increased his majority substantially, 7,500 last time. It's now nearly 13,500. That's a swing of 6.9%. Mr. Heath, of course, spent much of his time away from his constituency, campaigning throughout the country on behalf of the Conservatives. In Devon North, the seat held by Mr. Jeremy Thorpe, the returning officer, has reported a huge turnout of 89%. That's almost 10% up on 1974, and the result there is due in about half an hour. Well, one success for the Liberals that no doubt proved particularly satisfying was the retention of Liverpool Edge Hill. Now, that's the seat won by David Oulton, the 28-year-old teacher, who was an MP in the last Parliament for just 9 days before the dissolution. His majority this time was just over 4,200. That's almost half what it was at the by-election in March, but it was enough to send him back to Westminster. Well, one of the biggest swings of the night so far was at Anglesey, the seat of the Labour MP Cledwyn Hughes since 1951, who retired this time. It's been won by the Conservatives with a swing from Labour of 12.5%. Observers feel that Mr. Hughes' long tenancy there was due largely to his high personal standing. And finally, at Dagenham, a return to the Commons for the senior figure of Mr. John Parker, Labour MP there since 1946. Mr. Parker, who's 72, will be the father of the House in the new Parliament. He is the only member who was in the Commons before the war when he represented Romford. David.
Well, as you saw while Angela was talking, it was superimposed over her. Labour has regained Workington, the seat that they lost in one of those sensational mid-term by-elections, but they've lost Ealing North. At Lincoln, there's a recount. And interestingly, while we've been talking, the swing has been becoming much more even now across the country. We've had a few more results in from the Midlands. We're now up to 8. And we're showing a much more even swing towards the Tories. 5, 6, 5, 5, 5, that sort of swing. And only Scotland really is showing something different at the moment.
But it's only 3.2 in the marginal seats. Around the country, the swing is lower in the marginals. In a few cases, it's enabled Labour to hold on where they might otherwise have lost.
Let's just have a look at those results in full. This is the Conservative gain. William Malloy is out. He was a member of the European Parliament, but anti the EEC. And he came second in the poll. Harry Greenaway, Deputy Headmaster, wins. The swing to the Conservatives much lower than some we've been getting, only 3.9% at Ealing North.
And the National Front only 1.8 in that area, which is near the troubled areas of Southall.
And this is Liverpool Edge Hill, which the Liberals held, we were talking about a moment ago. David Alton, the MP there, just for those few 9 days or so.
His vote down from the by-election, but of course sensationally up from last time, up 24% from the Liberal vote in 1974, and the Labour Party down 17%, the Conservatives down 8%.
It's extraordinary the Labour vote almost doubled from the by-election. The turnout went up as well. I suppose this is because people who didn't bother to vote in the by-election did come out to vote today.
I should think there was some cross-switching. People have a right to vote differently in by-elections and general elections.
Now, Workington, which was the seat taken when Fred Peart, who was with us, who's now Lord Peart, which was why Labour lost Workington when he became a peer, and there was an astonishing swing to the Conservatives, but it's traditionally been a safe Labour seat since 1918, and it's gone back to the Labour Party.
With about a 6% swing, 5% swing compared to 1974.
I don't know whether we have any more results at that stage to go through. We've got Labour holding Mitcham and Morden. Bruce Douglas Mann, who's a solicitor, who holds on to that with a swing against him of 6%.
An island of Labour in a solid Conservative area of South London.
National Front doing very badly there indeed, 966, 2%. None of these 3.5% you've been having. Now this is Francis Pym, tipped as Foreign Secretary, as opposition spokesman on foreign affairs, tipped also as a future leader of the Tory party if Mrs. Thatcher hadn't won tonight, and he gets a swing of 6% in Cambridgeshire. We'll have a look at a few more results. Labour have held on to Darlington. Edward Fletcher has been the MP there since 1964. 2.9% swing, very small swing from Labour to the Conservatives in Darlington. And Northampton South, a Conservative seat, marginal. Majority was only 141 last time round, and now he's got a majority of 3,600 because 4.5 people in every 100 have switched from voting Labour to voting Conservative.
And if Northampton South goes like that, Northampton North and Moyne-Cahoon must go to the Conservatives.
Harold Lever, who's Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, held on to that seat, safe Labour seat. The constituency up there was one of the ones that gave their candidate a bit of trouble. The Labour Party up there decided that Mr. Lever wasn't quite as left-wing a candidate as they would like, but he was upheld in the end and fought the seat. A prominent person in the Labour Party who critics of the Labour Party always say is used to soothe the city and convince them that Labour doesn't mean any damage to high finance himself.
Incredibly low swing, only less
3%
than 1%.
swing.
No, in held Lever, less than 1% swing.
Sorry. Warrington, held by Labour, 3% swing there. And Edinburgh Leith, held with a majority of 4,000, a swing from Conservative to Labour of just 1.3%. The SNP go bottom of the poll there. They were in third place before. They only get 2,700 votes this time, but they got 7,000 at the last election. Their vote is down 16%, the SNP in Edinburgh Leith.
I think clearly...
I think we can hear in just a moment from Teddy Taylor, who was defeated, the man who was tipped to become Secretary of State for Scotland, who fought against devolution in Scotland, and who was defeated in Glasgow, Cathcart, talking to us.
Well, I think the Tories will gain seats in Scotland. I've spent a great deal of time over the last year trying to get things moving in Scotland. I think we'll end up with gains in Scotland because we have been making advances against the SNP. I think we'd also win some other seats too. I think it's good that as a result of this election we'll probably end up with more Tory seats in Scotland, whereas every election until now, recently, we've been losing seats.
Because of your work in Scotland, because particularly your work on devolution, you delivered the no vote for Mrs. Thatcher, it's generally considered. Do you think that has cost you your seat? Or has been a factor at least?
It could have been a factor. I think probably the main factor was the Labour Party threw everything into this result. It was always a key seat, always a touch-and-go seat, and I think they put in the supreme effort and they got the results.
What about your own future, Mr. Taylor?
Well, obviously, I'm delighted to have more time to spend with my wife and family. I've been in politics for a very long time. It's pretty tough, it's pretty arduous. I think, obviously, I'll be wanting to at least take some time to think things out, and I think I'll certainly be going into doing something quite different.
Teddy Taylor there. Well, the recount at Lincoln, we're told, is at the Labour Party candidate's request, Margaret Jackson. I don't know whether that's always significant at whose request a recount is. And there's a second recount in Keighley. This is in the middle of Bronte country in Yorkshire. It's been Labour since February 74, but it's changed hands 4 times since 1959. It needed a swing of about 3.5% or so.
Yes, and by the time you get to a second recount, it probably means it's in 2 figures, not 3 figures, the issue at stake.
Conservatives hold Croydon North West with a very small swing, 2.7% only.
But 5.9% in Croydon South.
Well, these are
less from the Liberals.
These are the gains we've had so far. These are the Tory gains so far. Let's just have a look at them, in case you've missed them. From Labour, Nelson and Cohen, Rossendale, Putney, Hornchurch. I don't think I need to read them all out. There they are. More to come. From SNP, from the Scottish Nationalists, Angus South. 9 gains in all. And Labour, of course, has made gains as well, and we'll have a look at those in just a moment.
We trailed...
Here we are, Glasgow Cathcart, the one we saw from the Conservatives, Teddy Taylor, Workington in that by-election, and from the SNP, Stirlingshire East and Clackmannan, and Dunbartonshire East. So that Labour's position is 4 gains, but they've had 8 losses, so the net change is that Labour is down 4.
We may have raised Liberal hopes by speaking of a recount in Salisbury. The Conservatives have now held it. There isn't by quite a comfortable margin.
Well, why were they recounting? We shall discover when we get the figures, I suppose. Perhaps they weren't recounting. Perhaps they just didn't believe they'd done so badly. We shall find out in a moment. Conservatives hold Norfolk North West.
The first result we've had from that part of the world.
Yes, swing of nearly 5% there. Jonathan Aitken is famous for being acquitted in the Secrets trial, the great Secrets trial, holding on to his safe seat. Smaller swings there in Brentwood.
But the collapse of the Liberal vote in the South East has been illustrated in all those last 3 things. There's another Wolverhampton result with a 5% swing. The swing in the Midlands is settling down, like in the rest of the country, around 5%.
So it looks as if the swingometer and Bob's predictions are actually going to prove remarkably accurate, doesn't it, in the end, if we're getting this average swing all the way through?
Well, our prediction has been fairly stable, the 343 or so Conservative seats. That's what the current thing. It's been within 3 or 4 seats of that for the last 70 or 80 results. And we've got clear of the bias we had at the beginning when we only had London and Scottish results, which were distorting the picture. But now we've got a fairly representative collection, except from rural areas and from the southwest of England, where the Liberals have some hopes still.
We're now predicting 343 Conservative seats in the new House, and only 269 Labour seats, and they only needed 318 to form a government. They're going to 343, we think.
There is no doubt that this is going to end up with the overwhelming bulk of the votes going over 80%, 83% or 84% of the votes going to 2 big parties instead of 75% as last time, and with there being a good deal less than the 38 other party MPs in the next House of Commons. There'll be under 30 representatives of the other parties. It may be down much nearer to 20.
Birmingham Ladywood, that was the seat that used to be Brian Walden's before he took up the more lucrative profession of television. And a safe Labour seat. We'll have a look at our prediction. Hugh Fraser back at Stafford-and-Stone, a swing of 5%. Here is the prediction. A majority over Labour of 74, which doesn't quite compare with what Harold Wilson managed in the election of 1966, does it?
No, it must be, those figures must be very bleak indeed for three parties, for the Scottish Nationalists, who've done really quite appallingly by any previous standards, for the Labour Party, who have clearly lost the election, and for the Liberals, who have failed, as far as we can see, though we haven't really heard from enough of the seats that matter, to fulfil David Steele's hopes, and who certainly are not going to be holding the balance of power in the next Parliament.
There are a number of very interesting seats to come up still. We haven't heard from many of the ones which we've had several recounts on. We've got Devon North we haven't heard from for some time. We were told they were going to get that in about half an hour ago or so. I don't know where things stand there.
Well, the Keighley one is the one. Keighley and Paddington are the two places where we've been told, obviously, it's a close thing, though Paddington, it was Labour who asked for the recount. Recount at Dulwich, yes. That's John Silkin's seat, and which is an extremely interesting one. Isn't that the one where Eric Morley is the challenger?
Where Mrs. Thatcher was just the other day.
Full
one
recount.
Of her last, a full recount.
And that means that they really are checking, they're not just checking the bundles, they're actually checking the individual votes.
Sam Silkin, I think, not John Silkin, that one. Sam Silkin. We go to Dundee East for the declaration.
Results of the election for the Dundee East constituency. The name of the candidate, Mr. Roy John Battersby, 95 votes. Mr. Charles Gilchrist Brodie, 2,317 votes.
Liberal.
Mr. James Reid, 17,978 votes.
Labour.
Mr. Brian James Taggart Townsend, 9,072 votes.
Conservative.
Mr. Gordon Wilson, 20,497.
Scottish Nationalist.
There were 71 spoiled papers. As returning officer, I therefore declare Mr. Gordon Wilson to be duly elected for the Dundee East constituency.
Happy Gordon Wilson. It was a tough fight against Jimmy Reid, the very popular former communist, the man who led the Upper Clyde shipbuilder struggle. Gordon Wilson, the SNP member who has held the seat since 1974.
Mr. Returning Officer, ladies and gentlemen, may I, on behalf of all the candidates in Dundee East, thank you, your staff, the counting agents and polling agents, the police and all those who took part in this election campaign.
Hello, Margot.
Hello, Robin.
What did you make of that one? That pleased you a bit, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely delighted, because Gordon Wilson's a gem. And I would have hated to lose that one, to be quite honest, but it bears out the pattern here, which is that although the SNP is not doing well, but I should correct one of your earlier commentators from south of the border who said we've never done as badly as this before. Believe me, we've done even worse than this and have bounced back. But I think we're probably going to have an uneven distribution of our vote, because the seat which we lost to the Conservatives, Angus South, wasn't lost by such a tremendous amount, and so therefore I think we have a good chance of holding another 2 of the seats in the northeast at least.
What about the loss of George Reid's seat and Margaret Bain's seat?
Great losses, both of them very talented, very good members of Parliament, but it looks as though Labour have gained former SNP votes, probably because there's a feeling in Scotland that since the Devolution Assembly Act is still lying on the table in Westminster, in Scotland they didn't believe, you see, that Mrs Thatcher could possibly form the next government, and I think people thought that if they voted Labour, that this would ensure the implementation of the Assembly Bill, and so the SNP lost votes in that way, I think.
Is this the view of an ignorant southerner, that it looks as if Scotland has voted against, well, it's obviously voted against the SNP in many respects, but it's also voted for Labour in its kind of devolution?
Well, I think it's voted against the Conservatives. It's voted against the Conservative policy of having no real Scottish Assembly, and it's voted in favour of having a Scottish Assembly. And since the SNP could never have formed a government in Westminster and Labour could, I think people made the logical step of voting Labour in order to try and get an Assembly.
And how about Teddy Taylor's defeat?
Oh, quite monumental, really. I think that the problems, though...
How do you account for that? Because even though you disagree with him, he was a popular figure and a powerful campaigner, wasn't he?
Yes, but there were 1 or 2 things lying below the surface in Scotland, and Teddy was very closely identified with 2 very unpopular things. 1, Mrs Thatcher, and 2, the fact that the Conservative Party was opposed to a Scottish Assembly, and I think he paid the penalty.
Who do you think will be the Scottish Secretary of State in a Tory government if there is one?
I don't know, but I wouldn't like to be in his shoes because Scotland's not going to vote Tory, and he's going to have to try and implement Tory policies against a background of people having voted Labour and having SNP and Labour local authorities.
Why didn't you stand in this election, Margaret?
I've been to Westminster and it's very nice.
I didn't quite understand that answer.
Well, I wasn't all that keen to go back, Mr. Day.
Why not?
Because I think I can do very much better work here in Scotland. I think it should be obvious to you that the results in Scotland are markedly different from the results south of the border. That's because our political patterns are actually different, and even the way in which we conduct our politicking between elections has shown itself to be very different.
Does this result suggest to you that if there is a Tory government, the result in Scotland will force them to think more seriously about having an elected Scottish Assembly, even if it's not exactly on the lines of the Labour Act?
Well, you see, people aren't voting for the Conservative policy. They're voting Labour to try and get the Scottish Assembly Bill, which is lying on the table in Westminster, and for which the majority of people who voted in the referendum voted yes. They're voting to get that implemented, and so therefore the Conservatives will have to do a massive rethink on their policy if we're going to see democratic ends served. You see, this happened before. We had this happening in 1970 in Scotland as well.
Thank you, Margot. Bye.
Bye.
Margot, just before you go, she's still there. We've heard the Conservatives have gained Banff from the SNP. I'm sorry to keep throwing this bad news at you, but what do you make of that one?
Very sorry about that too. Hamish Watt was a great MP. He was very much a man of the people in Banff. And I think the loss there is not really the SNPs. I think it's the loss is the people of Banffshire.
Well, thanks very much. Well, now, Labour has held Bolton East, and the significance of that will not be lost on you, which is that since 1950, I think it is, Bolton East is said always to have gone the way of the country. This time it looks as though Bolton East has lost that reputation and will no longer be one of those seats that we look to see how the country's gone. One other thing, we've had a 7% swing went through while Robin was talking there in Slough, a 7% swing against Joan Lester, a sign of the way things have been going today. She held the seat, but only with 1,000 or so votes and a 7% swing against her.
But the South had a nil swing, or less than 1% swing against Labour, against Laurie Pavitt. And in Handsworth, there was a straight fight. There was only a 1.2%. That's in Birmingham, Handsworth. I think the first seat we've had from inside Birmingham. Only a 1% swing, which may be rather significant.
Here's the full result from Dundee East, which the SNP held. This is Gordon Wilson, a majority of 2,500, a swing to Labour of 5%.
It may be that Jimmy Reid, as the ex-communist and his selection, caused some change the pattern there, because after George Reid had lost in Stirling, many people might have thought that Dundee would also go, but it was held quite comfortably by Gordon Wilson, who'll be there to comfort Donald Stewart if he holds on, as one's sure he will do, in Western Isles.
And here's the Eton and Slough result we were just talking about. Joan Lester, swing from Labour to the Conservatives is 7%. The National Front in Slough, tiny proportion of the vote, 943, it's under 2% in an area with many immigrants living in it.
The National Front have got less than 1% of the vote, although they've put up 3 times as many candidates as last time.
Now, Richard Kershaw was talking a moment ago to Lord Thornycroft at Smith Square. Now he has an even closer aide of Mrs. Thatcher's with him, Angus Maud. But just before we go there, we think Margaret Thatcher is just arriving at her count. There's a lady from a television channel I won't mention, standing there. I don't know where the gentleman from our television channel is.
But he's here.
Oh, he's there. Excellent, Michael. Sorry.
Here's Margaret Thatcher, this remarkable lady who looks very much on the predictions we've had so far, like being the first woman Prime Minister in all the long lines since Walpole have been placed at the head of affairs of this ancient nation-state. The long delay in her count here is because the number of ballot papers issued didn't add up to the number of votes cast. There's some discrepancy of a couple of hundred votes, but apparently the agents, you've been able to agree there was no real discrepancy to worry about, was there? This is Mrs. Thatcher's agent.
Welcome, Margaret. Wonderful.
Well, it's been a tremendous night for her, as the mayor is about to announce the the result of Mrs. Thatcher's poll here at her seat in Finchley.
Ladies and gentlemen, result of parliamentary election 3rd of May 1979, constituency of Barnet, Finchley division. The percentage of electors voting at the election for the constituency of Barnet, Finchley was 72.5. I, Norman James Sapstead, returning officer for the constituency of Barnet, Finchley, hereby declare that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows. Elizabeth Lloyd, Independent, 86. Richard George May, Labour, 13,040. Anthony John Patterson, a Liberal, 5,254. Margaret Hilda Thatcher, Conservative, 20,918.
Mrs. Thatcher's doubled her majority here since last time.
William Stokes Verity, National Front, 534. And I declare that the said Margaret Hilda Thatcher has been duly elected to serve as Member of Parliament for the said constituency. Congratulations, Margaret.
Here she is, a lady who looks like walking with destiny here tonight.
Mr. Mayor, by very happy tradition, my first duty is to thank the returning officer for the splendid way in which the people have presided at the polling booths and counted our count, and a particular word of thanks to the police for the way in which they have dealt with everything which has transpired, in what for obvious reasons turned out to be rather more than a strictly local election. I'd also like to thank my own supporters very much indeed. They have fought marvellously and I think will quite miss the scent of battle. May I commiserate with my opponents. I know what it's like sometimes to be on the losing side, but you know, if you go to other seats, things might change. And I'm sure that you will also have found enormous support from your own supporters and take great comfort in some aspect of the result. For us, this is a very good result, and I would like to say how very proud I am once again to represent Finchley and Frown Barnet. The night is yet young, and we don't quite know what it will hold. But I would like to say that whatever that may be, I've taken courage and inspiration from being your member here for 20 years. Sufficient courage and inspiration to face whatever the future may hold. Thank you very much.
So there are the full figures for Mrs. Thatcher's result. A smaller swing to the Conservatives than some other places in the London area, 4.7%, but a very handsome majority for the person who looks like being the first woman Prime Minister of Britain, certainly speaking there, as the result was declared, in a very generous way about her opponents and talking about the challenge that she thought she would face. Now, our prediction now, though Mrs. Thatcher was saying that what the night has to hold is still uncertain, is this. The Conservatives with a majority over Labour of 74, and there seems to be no question at all but that the Conservatives are home and dry, with 343 seats being predicted in the new House, after 200 results, just over 200 results have come in. Well, Mrs. Thatcher, who looked at sometimes in the campaign slightly under strain, there's the Conservative gain at Banff we were talking about before. Perhaps we should just see the figures there. Conservatives have held on. That's Deep Sproat, Ian Sproat at Aberdeen South has held on safely. tiniest swing there. But Mrs. Thatcher, who looked at the very end of the campaign, when the polls began to go against her, that one day when there were tiny percentage lead to Labour, suddenly seemed before the weekend nervous and rather worried, looking now very confident and very much like somebody who knows that their thoughts must now turn away from this election and towards government and towards the policy decisions she'll have to take and towards the formation of a cabinet, of the first woman's cabinet of Britain. Having a word there with the other candidates who each get their say, very briefly. Now, on the other side of the studio is a former leader of the Conservative Party, the person who was defeated by Mrs. Thatcher in the leadership battle, and he's with Robin Day.
Mr. Heath, you had a very satisfactory result from your point of view?
I was highly delighted. I got the highest poll I've ever had in this constituency, and I almost doubled my majority. It was a 7% swing. And what more could I ask than that?
Well, you could ask certain more things, but I won't mention them. What?
I don't think so, because I spent the greater part of the campaign up and down the country. I only had a very short time in Sidcup. The result was that all my supporters worked very hard for me.
Do you share our computer's prediction, if that is the right word, of a fairly substantial Conservative overall majority?
Oh, I can't judge your computers, can I, or your predictions. I would have thought that it shows that it's a reasonable Conservative majority, but I thought also that there are signs that the regional variations are greater than were anticipated at the beginning of these discussions.
To what do you attribute these regional variations, in particular the northwest, and we'll come to Scotland in a moment?
I think probably the fact that they are more worried about unemployment and regional development and economic aspects of that kind. I think in Scotland, of course, you've got the very difficult question as to what is happening to the SNP and what's happening to its vote when it disintegrates.
It looks a bit as if they're voting solidly against the, not solidly, but severely against SNP independence policy, but voting in favour of a Labour kind of devolution policy, which includes the sort of assembly you wanted.
Well, I don't know that they're voting in favour of what you described as a Labour sort of devolution. I think they are voting, as between the two major parties, for Labour because it believes in devolution and has shown it wants to achieve devolution.
Does the Scottish results so far, do they suggest to you that you were right about policy in Scotland, from the point of view of the Conservative Party and from the point of view of doing the right thing?
I think so, yes. I believed it was right from the point of view of the better government of Scotland that there should be a form of devolution. It's very difficult to get it right, but I think it also shows that the Scottish people don't want independence, but they do want to have more say in their own government.
Did you enjoy your campaign?
Enormously, yes.
I watched you coming into one hall with all the nice girls love a sailor, and you seem to be having a new life, if I may say so.
I'm not quite sure what that remark implies, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's been a very good campaign. I've covered the whole country. I've made 70 or more speeches. I've done innumerable interviews, and I've been delighted with the reception I've had.
But you seem to be almost the only person in the campaign who really hit out at a leader of one of the parties in what I might call the old style of political campaigning. You really went for Mr. Callaghan in a big way, didn't you?
Well, perhaps that's because I'm old-fashioned. But it's quite untrue to say that I attacked Mr. Callaghan. That was never my intention, and it was quite unnecessary to attack Mr. Callaghan. All one has to do is to be fair to Mr. Callaghan, and that's what I tried to be.
Let me ask you this, Mr. Heath, and I think you know the question I'm going to ask. What is your answer to it?
My answer is that you'll have to wait and see, won't you?
But would you like to?
It depends.
I think I ought to explain to the viewers that I was in fact asking you in code whether you would accept a senior post in Mrs. Thatcher's administration if there is one and if you are offered one.
Well, that really is a triple hypothetical question, isn't it? To which I don't propose to give a hypothetical answer.
I haven't seen you in such good form for such a long time, Mr. Heath. It's very nice to talk to you. I don't know whether we'll talk to you again. If you can stay a little while longer, we'd be delighted to have your company. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So, Mrs. Thatcher, Michael Charlton just moving towards her there. She's going out of the hall. He may not be able to get a word in edgeways. Mr. Thatcher seems to be blocking the way. Oh, Michael.
She's just told me, David, that she's, you can see her husband here and her daughter, Carol, that she's not doing any interviews, but I asked her how she felt, and she said, I feel wonderful. So, that's right, Mrs. Thatcher, isn't it? You felt wonderful.
Absolutely superb. Yes, thank you very much.
Right.
Mrs. Thatcher feeling absolutely superb.
Multitude of press photographers who's followed them round on this campaign. Well, these are all the pictures you'll be seeing in the national and international press tomorrow of a famous woman and a unique political figure.
And you know, we're very friendly, even though we're Mr.
Thatcher himself has played a quite prominent part in this campaign. He's been with Mrs. Thatcher on all the platforms and triggered many of the responses from her audiences. She's now commiserating with the unsuccessful supporters of the Labour candidate here, and that's probably the last we see of her, I think, until she goes back to Smith Square. She looks... this is what she has to put up with from now on. Irreverent calls of Maggie from the stills photographers.
Well, Mr. Callaghan in Cardiff, as Mrs. Thatcher faces the press, the spectacles of the Prime Minister, and he appears still to be smiling as he waits for his count, though you must know that the chances of his not losing tonight are now very remote indeed. Talking to one of the other candidates, the Liberal candidate. Green is the colour for the Liberals in Wales. All the colours are different all over the country. I'm not quite sure which. The Conservatives have gained Northampton North, and that's not all they've gained while we've been away. They've also gained Lincoln. SNP held on to the West Niles. And they've gained Newark as well. David Steele up in Scotland at his count. So the three party leaders, thousands of miles or hundreds of miles apart, joined by television, waiting, I think, for the declaration of David Steele's result. So let's go up there to Selkirk.
How could they come? And Mr. Adam Napier, the returning officer, just waiting to give the result in David Steele's constituency. Roxburgh, Selkirk and Peebles. Mr. Steele looking a little tired after yet another day that started at 7 o'clock this morning. It's been a massive turnout of 81.1% here, as against 79% last time. And the count's gone extraordinarily well because Mr. Napier, who's standing there now, has employed expert bank tellers from all the banks in town to get through the votes as quickly as possible. David Steele's been listening on a radio to the not very encouraging news for his Liberal revival. Doesn't look all that cheerful. Oh, perhaps he does. Mr. Napier.
As returning officer for the Roxburgh, Selkirk and Peebles parliamentary constituency, I hereby declare that the total number of votes given for each candidate in this election was as follows. David Albert Heald, Labour, 4,150. Gerald Malone, Conservative, 15,303. David Martin Scott Steele, Liberal, 25,009.
Sir.
25,993. Angus Stewart, Scottish National Party, 3,502.
Sir, an increase of 5,000 for David Steele and
Majority 10,690.
But the SNP are pushed into fourth place, and David Steele increases his majority from 7.5 to 10,000.
I hereby declare that David Martin Scott Steele has been duly elected to serve as the member for the said constituency.
Well, in the past few days, Mr. Steele's carried out an enormously energetic campaign up here.
It is my very pleasant task, first of all, to thank the returning officer, Mr. Napier, and the counting staff here tonight, and the presiding officers at the polling stations throughout the day for their very efficient conduct of the election in this constituency. I want also to express a word of thanks to the police, who as usual have conveyed the ballot boxes from the far-flung parts of Roxburgh, Selkirk and Peebles with great expedition. On this occasion, my thanks to the police must be more than a formality. They have borne considerable strains during the election campaign, both locally, those who've been with me on the nationwide tour, and the police forces in other parts of the country. And I mean that very sincere thank you to our police forces.
So with David Steele's very predictable results, this is Philip Tivenham in
This has
Selkirk.
been a very remarkable result in this constituency, and there are some...
Well, now there's the full result of David Steele's constituency, and it gives the lie to the idea that they only respect and vote for an MP when he spends all his time in the constituency looking after their interests, because David Steele, as leader of the Labour Party, has got a handsome increase in his majority of 3,000. Mrs. Thatcher, leaving Finchley now with being jostled by the crowd with police escort around her. She will be no doubt even more carefully protected now at this stage in the campaign. Getting into her car, and we think she'll now go to the Conservative Party headquarters in Smith Square. Her husband trying to clear a way for himself before the car leaves there. So we should be seeing Mrs. Thatcher next among jubilant party workers down in Smith Square. At least if she sticks to the plan that she had at the beginning of the evening, that's what she'll be doing. And she must know now that she is safely home and dry.
Good luck, Maggie! Good luck, Maggie!
I should just say to my old friends up in Barrow, where I spent one general election, that they must have been very puzzled indeed, as must all the voters of the Western Isles, when I suddenly announced that the SNP, or at least a headline of ours announced, that the SNP had held the Western Isles. So I can't actually believe that the Western Isles votes have even been counted, let alone got together from all the outlying islands. I may be wrong. There may be some magical way of doing it these days.
David, there was a result there that wouldn't delight Mrs. Thatcher. Dartford has been won by the Conservatives. That's the seat that she fought in 1950 and 51, and in this evening of her triumph, it's actually gone Conservative.
Enfield North has also been gained by the Conservatives. The turnout at Devon North, we said, was 89%. It was actually 81.9%. That was just simple wrong information. So it wasn't a staggering turnout at Devon North, but we haven't had it yet. Now, here are the figures in Dartford. A swing from Labour to the Conservatives of 7.8%. Robert Dunn, who fought Eccles in February and October, is safely here in Dartford. Sidney Irving, the Labour MP, former chairman of the Manifesto Group, that's to say a moderate Labour MP, is out at Dartford. The National Front, once again, do very badly. The Liberals drop 5%.
It's the second time. You can see the change there, which is the sort of East London, north and south of the Thames, has been showing well above average swings, and that has cost the Labour Party Dartford and defeated Sidney Irving for the second time in Dartford. We have missed out, incidentally, on some very interesting results in the East Midlands. 4 Conservative gains in the East Midlands, all on well above average swings. Newark, Lincoln, Northampton North and Peterborough, all on 6-7% swings. Very different from the pattern we've had elsewhere.
Let's just look then at some of these Conservative gains. Here, for instance, is Banff. majority of only 799. This is an area from Cairngorms to the Murray Firth. And Hamish Watt, who was the SNP spokesman on fishing and all kinds of other things, and their chief whip from 76 to 78, comes second at the poll.
One of the SNP's best hopes lost.
And then Lincoln. Now, Lincoln's an interesting seat. The Conservatives have taken Lincoln. This was the seat where Dick Taverne, you remember, the renegade Labour MP who formed his own Social Democratic Party because of Labour's refusal to support Britain's entry into the common market, and he successfully fought an election there. And there was, this time, a standard, what do we call it, standard, a straightforward Labour candidate, Margaret Jackson, standing, and she was defeated. The Conservatives, Kenneth Carlyle, who was third at the last election, has gone top of the poll. And then we have a Conservative gain in Newark, which has been Labour since 1950, to the northeast of Nottingham, an industrial area. Ted Bishop, Minister of State at Agriculture there, on a swing of 6.6%, defeated. And then we have a Conservative gain, another one, at Northampton North, a swing of 8% from Labour to the Conservatives, and that's Maureen Cahoon, who attracted a great deal of publicity, the Labour candidate who's defeated, a great deal of publicity, particularly when she declared herself a homosexual and fought for women's rights. And there was some trouble in her constituency and some criticism of her in Northampton.
Reduced to quite exceptional swing, too. 8% is the largest I think we've had north of London.
The Conservatives gain Peterborough. This is one of the seats that's often been a cliffhanger. In fact, had the record number of recounts back in 1966, I think, when Sir Harman Nichols had 7 recounts and only won by 3 votes. Well, this Conservative candidate is safely in on a gain with 5,000 majority and a swing of 6%. Another gain at Enfield North. Brian Davis out there, one of the parliamentary private secretaries that Callaghan sacked for voting against import duties. He sacked several during his brief period as Prime Minister. A swing to the Conservatives of 8%, and the Liberal vote dropping 10% from 19 to 9. And the Conservatives have gained Rochester and Chatham. Peggy Fenner, used to be known as Price's Peg. The Conservative is back in at Rochester and Chatham with a swing of 4.4%. And Liverpool Garston has been taken by the Conservatives, a swing of 5%. Eddie Lloyden, a Tribunite, out there, and the new candidate Malcolm Thornton, who's a pilot on the River Mersey, wins that seat. Now, David Owen, I can see, with his wife beside him down at Plymouth, Devonport, looking not like a man who thinks he's won his seat. We heard a rumour that he hadn't won his seat, but I think we can find out a bit more if we join Richard Lindley, who's down there with him. Richard?
David, everybody's playing it very close to their chest here. The returning officer's running a very tight ship, which is perhaps appropriate in Plymouth, Devonport. And David Owen certainly isn't saying yet whether he thinks he's won or not. At the moment, the two agents are counting, the Labour and Conservative agent are counting each other's bundles of votes there. It clearly is fairly close. Our impression here is that David Owen is in, but that is our impression. I say again, that is what various people have suggested to us, but it is not clear yet, and we're waiting for the result to be declared.
Is that a headline? I was just looking to see something, but I couldn't find out what it was. Jeff Rooker, by the way, we saw held. That was the Rooker of the Rooker-Wise Amendment, when 2 left-wing Labour MPs put forward a motion that our taxes should be indexed at the lower level, that the allowances should rise with the cost of living, and the Conservatives voted with them. And it did him enough good to get back.
Well, he held on. Birmingham is going to have a very low swing. It's going to be interesting. The 3 seats, at least, if not 4, the Conservatives would gain. 2 of them have actually now been held by Labour, Handsworth and Perry Barr.
Let's just see how the national share of the vote is going at the moment and see the way that it's changed in particular, because this is going to give a good indication. We've had 267 results in, and you see the Conservatives are now ahead on the popular vote. They've had 42%. That's about just under 5 million votes Conservative, and a bit less than that for Labour at 41%. And the Liberals running at about 12%, which is what the polls said they would do, I think, overall, just a bit, perhaps that or a bit more. And there is the true story of the night, with 267 results in, 367 still to come, it has to be said. The Conservative vote up 8%. The Liberals down 4%, Labour down 2%, the SNP in Scotland down 3%.
That's 3% from a very low total. They're much more than half, because they, of course, only put up candidates in Scotland. The other parties are fighting right across the country, and those figures will be substantially sustained, I think, through the night and through the results that we have tomorrow.
That recount of Bury and Radcliffe is a matter of 2 votes, so they may well rival the recount that they had in Peterborough when they had 7. I mean, how do you recount 2 votes?
And that's
You've gone
almost
forever.
a nil swing, because there was only a 400 majority last time,
That's
so it's
right.
almost no movement
The
in that
Conservatives
show.
have held on to Pembroke in Wales. That's interesting. Nicholas Edwards.
With a very big majority.
And they thought he might be in trouble there. Labour was hoping to take that seat, but it's been held by the Conservatives. And Labour has held on to Newham North East, where there was all that fuss with Reg Prentice. It's not surprising. It's a safe Labour seat. They swing 5% against Labour to the Conservatives. That was the seat where the new candidate, you remember, was selected after the election had been announced, when the other candidate left on the grounds that his own constituency party wouldn't back the manifesto that he had put forward.
Did you see that the other Jim Callaghan held on in Middleton and Prestwick? There are several marginal seats in Lancashire that haven't switched, and 1 or 2 ones that only just switched when they ought to have gone easily on the swing we've been having so far tonight.
I'm still watching out here for David Owen's vote to come in, and the candidates down there at Plymouth are still standing around waiting for it to happen. So in the meantime, let's rejoin Robin. Robin?
And with me, Sir Geoffrey Howe, who had a win in his constituency of Surrey East. Sir Geoffrey, are you confident of an overall majority for Mrs. Thatcher in the new Parliament?
Well, Mrs. Thatcher said yesterday that there were substantial grounds for cautious optimism. I think I would now withdraw the word cautious.
Why do you think there have been such variations?
I think it has been interesting. There have been variations as between candidates and as between regions. I think it does show that people in different parts of the country are concerned about different things, and they have been paying more attention to the individuals, which is quite encouraging.
Are you pleased or disappointed at the impact of the Tory campaign on the critical marginals?
I think it's been pretty good. We can hardly complain about some of the things we've been getting. Particularly impressed by the results that are coming from the East Midlands, which are very encouraging indeed.
What about Scotland and the loss of Teddy Taylor?
That's a very sad loss.
How do you interpret it?
Well, Teddy Taylor has always really had a better standing in the opinion polls in Scotland than the Tory party. I think the fact that he's held on to Cathcart as well as he had is a tribute to his personality, and unfortunately the swing there, or the natural tendency of the seat, has finally unseated him.
I think Malcolm Rifkind is in Edinburgh, Pentland, we've just heard. If there is a Conservative government, and if you are Chancellor of the Exchequer, when could we expect your budget?
I think I would need to take advice about that,
but not on May the 23rd, which was going to be Mr. Healy's date.
I think that would be a date it would be easier for him to meet, having already written his budget speech, than it would be for us.
Why do you think the Conservatives haven't done better?
I think
assuming the predictions are roughly right of a modest overall majority, which was Mr. Heath's instinct, though not prediction.
I think that we have done very well, if you think that we had to get quite a large swing to get that. I think, of course, there have been...
When you think of all the trouble Labour had in the winter, when you think of your lead in the opinion polls, wasn't something lacking in your campaign?
No. But when you think of the strength with which, for example...
Your colleague Nigel Lawson is in with a scraped home with a majority of 20,000, I see.
Well, he's got a majority even larger than mine. I envy him that. I think the interesting thing is this, isn't it, that there is an inherent stability about our political system which tends to come back towards the centre. And when Winston Churchill won, for example, in 1951, it was a matter of inching back the ground. And we've come back to that kind of balance in this election as well.
But it's nice to see the age of swing come to a slight end, don't you think?
I entirely agree. I think that swings turn us into kind of automata, which isn't a very attractive role.
We're in the age of political rock, I think, now.
We're in an age of political reality rather than rock, I think. At least it isn't punk rock.
I just want to bring in David Alton, who's the newly elected MP, the said David Alton for the constituency of Liverpool Edge Hill. Mr. Alton, what do you feel about your reduced majority?
Well, it was hardly a reduced vote. I think that's far more important. In fact, the vote is about the same as it was last time, and the Liberals in Liverpool Edge Hill polled as polled more votes, in fact, than the other three parties put together. So I don't think that's a mean achievement. Indeed, it's the first seat which the Liberals have won in any major city in a general election in probably about 50 years. So I'm quite pleased with the achievement.
Did you think all this was going to happen when we were having our talk together at your Stockport conference last September?
Well, it was Southport, and I was only thinking about...
Southport, yes.
Yes, indeed, I was thinking about that talk